Hora Varga is one of the few Vargas where they actually give some yogas for the interpretation and understanding of that Varga. You'll see a couple yogas maybe for the Drekana and lots for that involved in Navamsha. See the Dwadasamsha mentioned a couple times. See the Shashtyamsha mentioned a couple times. And you really don't see any yogas on any of the other Vargas at all. So it's really rare to have even a few yogas that involve a Varga. Oh, and you also see some for the Trimsamsha Lords, but not for the Trimsamsha Varga itself. So we're sort of lucky that there is a few yogas to help point us in the right direction when it comes to reading the Hora chart. The yogas, though, are, minimal, not even a dozen of them. They're not all that amazing and profound, but they do show some worthwhile points. And as few yogas as there are that, involve the Hora, it's still more than we find on the other Vargas that have any mention with respect to yogas too. So just so you know, there's very, very little on the Vargas in the old books. And again, the old books, most of what they say is given in the result of, if this is this, you are like this. So it's in yoga type form. And so when there's no yogas on a Varga, it means there's really nothing on a Varga. So there is a little bit on the Hora. So the first one, there's a couple from Sankati Nidhi which are good. It's one of the better books out there when it comes to Vargas and yogas. This text says, the native will be lame if Chandra or the moon is in Surya's Hora and aspected by Saturn. So the person will be lame if the moon is in the sun's Hora and aspected by Saturn. Okay? Now, they may not always be physically lame. If there's other things in the chart that show pretty good, no problems with their bodies and so on, they're not going to be necessarily physical lame. But the idea of this sutra is important. It tells us, first of all, the moon is the most important planet in the Hora, as we've already talked about. Okay? We know that when the moon is aspected by Saturn, it lends towards depression and lethargy. Okay? Because Saturn's a cruel, hard planet, and the moon likes to be light and fun, and has a hard time withstanding the burdens of Saturn in general. Now, if that moon is in the sun's Hora, that's the Hora that the moon finds less fulfillment in, it makes a person lame. So another way to look at that, if you get an afflicted moon, and Saturn's afflicting it, and the moon's in the Hora of the sun, the affliction is worse and more debilitating, which means there's less desire to go out in the world to do something, a greater tendency for depression or to be lame, so to speak. Okay? So it's pretty simple. We've already kind of covered that just by understanding the Hora. But, most texts, they don't cover things in that way. They just give a yoga and let you try to figure out what's happening. So this is one from Sankati Nidhi. From the same text, he goes on to say, if at the time of query or birth, so either in a prajna chart or in a birth chart, the Lagna Lord and Lord of the house are concerned are so placed that they fall in the same Drekana, Hora, or Navamsha, there will be success in respect to the concerned house. In all these cases, the effect will be in proportion to the strength of the planets concerned. So, if the Lagna Lord and the Lord of the house concerned are in the same Hora, meaning not the Hora of the sun or not the Hora of the moon, but in the same Hora sign in the Hora chart, like both in Aries or both in Taurus, you're supposed to have more success with that house. Okay? The way you have to use that yoga, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to have success just because of this. No, you have to read the planets, check their Lajitati Avashtas, see if they're capable of giving any success, and then if they're in the same Hora, they'll be able to produce more success. Now, for planets to be in the same Hora, they have to be in the same half of a sign and conjunct, or they have to be in opposite sides, and in opposite signs and in different halves. So one planet has to be, say, in the first half of Aries, and the other planet has to be in the second half of Libra. When that happens, the two planets will fall in the same Hora in the Hora chart. And then if those planets are in good dignities, have good Lajitati Avashtas, and can produce, then it's going to be a more firm knit thing in your life. Because the Hora is what you're responsible for, what you have in your life, what you take care of. It's a concrete thing to get satisfaction for. if that planet is with your Lagna Lord in the Hora, and we're taking the Lagna Lord from the Rashi and the House Lord from the Rashi and seeing where if they're in the same Hora, in the Hora chart, in the same sign in the Hora chart. Well, then we're just going to be knit more tightly with that Baba and have it more in our lives. And if those lords are well disposed, it's going to be a much better, great thing. Okay? And so that lets us know sort of, say we see a planet at 14 Aries and one at 20 Aries. They're really close together, but they're in different Horas. So if your Lagna Lord is at 14 Aries and your 7th Lord's at 20 Aries, it won't be as much of a thing in your life because they're in different Horas, as if they were in conjunction in the same Hora. Okay? This next one's sort of interesting. It's at the time of query, and this also works in birth, Lagna falls in the Hora of the Sun, the person would not have enjoyed happiness in his childhood. Later, by his own efforts, he would get a lift in life and become wealthy. So if you have your Lagna in the Hora of the Sun, you're not happy in childhood. Why? Well, because you're meant to have more world karmas, not ancestral karmas. So you're simply not going to have the affinity for family life and feel as happy in family life type living situations as you are when you go out there and start making things happen in the world. So later, by his own efforts, he would get a lift in life and become wealthy. So the success comes later, the happiness comes later, because the person is fulfilling their karmic responsibilities, or responsibilities towards the world at large. Okay? Now, if the Lagna is well disposed and other family things are well disposed, that person's not going to be miserable in their childhood. They're not going to have a bad childhood. But they still won't be completely connected to their family life. They'll definitely have a greater sense of adventure and want to do more things because the son wants to go and do it. It's not content to just sit around with the family and eat food and chat on the couch. Okay? Now, on the other hand, if the Lagna falls in the Hora of the Moon, the person would be happy in his childhood and face difficulties in his later life. So this person, as long as they're in the family environment and have good family support, they're going to feel happier and more satisfied and giving that too. But when they're out there on their own, they won't feel as secure or happy. And it'll be harder for them to make it in the world. Now again, if their Lagna is afflicted and their moon is afflicted and their other family things are afflicted, they're really not going to have a good family life. They'll be really dependent upon that family life, but it will not be an enjoyable family life. Okay? And just because the Lagna is in the Hora of the Moon doesn't mean a person can't go out there and become successful. It's just more difficult for them to do. It's harder for them to tackle the things of the world. They're just more family-centered in general. Okay? Okay, this next yoga is really interesting. It can be really useful. Because one of the things that's really, really tough to figure out in astrology is appearance, in the sense of, are they attractive or unattractive? So say somebody gives you your birth data and you haven't seen them and you want to know if they're attractive or not. How do you know that? There's not much information on that. Jaimini Sutras has some yogas or one yoga that we can apply to see if the person has an attractive face. But here's another one based on the Hora that's real interesting. If the Lord of the Hora in which Lagna falls at the time of query is associated with a malefic and a retrograde planet, the eyes and face of the Aquarius will not be good looking. So, the second house is the face, the Hora is the second Varga, therefore the second Varga has to do with your face. That's sort of an important concept, okay? So, to see how our face looks, we take the Hora Lagna Lord, okay? And that Hora Lagna Lord is going to represent our face. Then we take that Hora Lagna Lord and we look at it in the Rashi chart. If it's with a malefic or a retrograde, and honestly, I don't find retrogrades to really cause unpleasant appearances, but if it's with a malefic, the person will have a less pleasant face. But on the other hand, if that planet's with the benefic, they'll have a more pleasant face. And the better the dignity of that planet and the better dignity of the planet the benefic it's with, the more attractive their face will be. Okay? And this works quite well. You can get an idea if the person can have an attractive face or not If their face is more Venusian, more Jupiterian, more Saturnian, more Rahu inclined, whatever, by taking the Lord of the Lagna in the Hora and seeing if it's conjunct any planet in the Rashi chart. And if it's not, you can look to aspects to it. But conjunctions will make the biggest difference. And then you could get a kind of an idea if the person's going to be attractive or not and what planet's given that beauty. Okay? If malefics occupy the sun's Hora in odd Rashis, one will be strong, sturdy, cruel in behavior, and wealthy. Okay? The one born with benefics posited in the lunar Hora of even Rashis will be brilliant in appearance, speak mildly, be pleasant and graceful. Okay, so these two ideas, which are from Phala and also given by Brihat Jataka as well, as you'll see later, kind of don't follow the ideas of Brihat Parashar. Brihat Parashar wants not malefics in the sun's Hora, but Sun, Mars, and Jupiter in the sun's Hora. And it doesn't want necessarily benefics in the lunar Hora. It wants Venus, Moon, and Saturn in the lunar Hora. Okay? So this is not the same thing. It seems to contradict it, but it's not. Because for those planets to really fructify and be satisfied, we want the male planets in the male Hora, in the sun Hora, and the female planets and Saturn in the Hora of the moon. This has to do with the person's behavior. Okay? Malefics are the tough planets. Okay? In odd Rashis, which are cruel signs, they get tougher. And if they're in the Hora of the sun, and the sun's a cruel planet, they get tougher yet. So if your malefics are in odd signs in the sun's Hora, that's as cruel as they get. That's as tough as those malefics get. But that doesn't mean those malefics are going to be satisfied or happy. Saturn will never be happy in and satisfied in the Hora of the sun. He has to be in the Hora of the moon to do that. Okay? Now Sun and Mars will be satisfied in these conditions, but Saturn won't. Then for the benefics, which basically is Moon, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus, and again, that's the moon when it's waxing, not waning. When it's waning, it's a malefic. So those planets, in an even sign, which is a gentle sign, in the moon's Hora, which is a gentle planet, are more gentle. They're brilliant in appearance, speak mildly, be pleasant and graceful. So these yogas have to do with how the character is, how the person behaves. It has nothing to do with their level of satisfaction. We all know so many sweet-talking, gracious, humble, pleasant people who are completely unsatisfied and unhappy in their lives, right? Okay, so this just has to do with how the person behaves and acts, okay? Now, and then it says, if it is otherwise, the effects also will be otherwise. If mixed, the effects will be mixed, okay? But the important thing behind this is that, let's take a malefic like Saturn. And let's say Saturn's having a bad day, which is like every day, right? And Saturn indicates all of our pain and the burdens we carry, the burden of pain and personal frustrations and sense of lack that we carry with us. Different people will go about fulfilling that suffering in different ways, either in an aggressive way or a passive way. If the sun is afflicted and the person has a low self-esteem, they're going to go about trying to fulfill that lack in a certain way. Okay? If Venus is afflicted and the person has a low sense of self-worth, say Saturn's conjunct Venus, for instance, the person's going to want to try to fulfill that self-worth somehow through some compensatory method. So whenever we have a lack in an afflicted planet, and again, Saturn, Rahu are the planets that really create a sense of lack in a planet. So when a planet's afflicted like that, it's feeling a sense of lack, we try to compensate for what's missing. Something's missing within ourselves and we try to compensate. We can compensate in an aggressive way or a passive way. Odd signs and the sun's Hora tends to compensate in an aggressive way. Even signs in the moon Hora tends to compensate in a passive way. So, would you rather be around somebody who's compensating in a passive way or an aggressive way? A passive way, right? So the person who's got Saturn with the moon, and the moon's in an even sign and in the Hora of the moon, when they're depressed, they're just going to sit there and be abjectly miserable, have no way to get out of it, not try to get out of it, They're just going to go suffer and crawl over to the fridge, start eating ice cream. Okay? Now, let's say the moon's in an odd sign, in the hora of the sun and conjunct the Saturn. Now, that person gets depressed and is finding their needs not met. They're going to get aggressive in trying to fulfill that need. And they're going to go find someone and tell them, this is what I need you to do. And become demanding or nagging. Both people are suffering the very same thing. It's just one person tries to fulfill it in an aggressive way, while the other person just silence more and stuff in silence. Now, at first you might say, well, geez, in that case, I want the person who's going to just suffer in silence, instead of the person who comes and starts yelling at me to do this for them. But the truth is, neither situation is happy. It's just you suffer pain in a different way. So let's say you're in love with someone, with Saturn, with the moon, they fall into depression easily. And if that person has, the moon in an odd sign, an odd hora, then when they're feeling depressed and needy, they're going to come and start putting demands on you. And if you fulfill those demands, they're not going to feel any better, because the problem originates within the self when it comes to the unhappiness that Saturn creates. If you, I think my light bulb just went out up there, so I kind of got distracted. Okay, just like another light bulb died. So anyway, but you'll be in conflict with the person at the time. You have to do it or you don't. They get more upset at you or they're not. In either case, they're not going to be happy. And that hurts, because the person came up and nagged you and made demands on you that weren't fair, and you just want them to go and be happy. And it hurts in a very kind of competitive, violent, clashing, frustrating, let's fight, have a fight type of way. But then you get your person who's got the Saturn moon in the moon's hora in an even sign. And they're depressed, and they don't come after you to tell you they need this, any of that. You just see them in this constant state of depression. And it hurts just as much to see that person you love in that state of depression as it does to have them come yell at you and fight. Either way, you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer either because they're demanding upon you, or you're going to suffer because it hurts you so much to see them suffering. So in either case, it's hard to have a relationship with a person who's got Saturn with the moon, whether it's in the odd or even hora. It's just they'll be nicer to you if it's in the hora of the moon and in an even sign than if it's in the hora of the sun and in a male sign. But in either case, you're going to suffer equally, because you're either going to be in conflict with them and therefore hurt, or it's just going to hurt you so much to see them suffering. So, in either case, the person with the Saturn moon needs to learn how to find a little more interior happiness so they can cope with life better, with the sad parts of life better. So these yogas just have to do with that nature. Do we go about things in a more aggressive way, which makes us cruel and pushy, or in a more passive way? Even signs, moon's hora is more passive. So while it's good to understand that, just to see why a person might behave a certain way, underneath all that, the important thing is that planet capable of finding satisfaction? And Sun, Mars, and Jupiter are only capable of finding full satisfaction in the hora of the sun. Whether in the male or female sign doesn't matter. So you want them in the hora of the sun. Moon, Venus, and Saturn, you want in the hora of the moon so that they can find satisfaction. And Mercury in an odd sign in the hora of the sun and an even sign in the hora of the moon will find the greatest satisfaction. Okay, just as Parashara taught. So here's another interesting one. The moon produces good effects in the solar or lunar hora of a Rashi, if she's aspected by grahas occupying respectively the solar or lunar horas. So, while for the moon to be satisfied, we want her in the moon's hora, as Parashara told us. Brihat Jataka is telling us the moon in its dasha will give the good effects if it's in the sun's hora and aspected by planets in the sun's hora, or if it's in the moon's hora and aspected by planets in the moon's hora. Why is that? Well, the moon has reflective qualities. It reflects the light of the sun, so to speak. So it's going to some degree, be able to reflect what's imposed upon it. So if a planet in the sun's hora is aspecting it or conjunct it, it can reflect some of that, but it's only going to really be reflected in a powerfully useful way if the moon itself is in the sun's hora. Now the moon itself won't become satisfied on account of that, but it will let the moon do more in its period. So this is sort of a yoga to help you see, okay, moon dasha is here. To see if moon's going to be satisfied in this period, I have to see if the moon's in the sun's or moon's hora. In the moon's hora, it has a greater capacity for satisfaction. But I also want to see how much the sun can just do. Because you can do a lot and be totally unsatisfied, right? If in that case the moon's in the moon's hora and aspected by planets in the moon's hora, it'll do more. If it's in the sun's hora and aspected by planets in the sun's hora, it will do a lot too. But it won't be as satisfied as when it's in the moon's hora, aspected by planets in the moon's hora. Okay? So this is a different idea. When I use the hora, I really look at what I taught you guys in the previous 3 classes on the hora. I wanted to cover these yogas because sometimes you'll want to use ideas behind them, but you don't need to look at these on every chart. They're not the real meat of the hora. They just help us understand some of the dynamics of the chart a little better. And most I wanted to cover them so you understand that these are not contradictions to what Brihat Parashara said. They're just a different idea, a different concept. It's more about externally what's happening, not about the person's satisfaction with what's happening, which is what's really important if we want to look at the Hora chart for happiness, okay, which is one of the things it represents. So that moon in the sun's hora might be pretty productive if it's aspected by planets in the sun's hora, even though the moon wants to be in the moon's hora anyway. When the malefic planets occupy the first half of any odd sign, which is the solar hora odd signs, the individual will become widely famous, energetic, strong, wealthy, and very powerful. So this is the yoga. Malefics in odd signs in the sun's hora will do a lot more. But Saturn won't be satisfied in that place because it needs to be in the moon's hora to be satisfied. Okay? Benefics in an even sign in the lunar hora, the individual will become gentle and delicate in constitution, fair in complexion, and will make friends with many. One will be fortunate, intelligent, of sweet speech, and liked at all. So that same idea that Sankiti Nidhi gave us. The person will be a nice person, have comforts in life, basically, when benefic planets are in even signs and moon's hora. But the benefic Jupiter won't be satisfied there. He needs to be in the sun's hora to be satisfied. So it's a different thing. If the hora is occupied by the malefic and benefic planets are the same as mentioned while the rashis are different, then one will possess the qualities that have been stated for the 2 yogas to a mediocre degree. But if both the horas and the signs are different, the effects will fail. So he just tells you how to mix it up there. So this follows the same idea from Sankiti Nidhi. You know, malefics in the sun's hora and odd signs are more powerful, more aggressive, will try to tackle more, and therefore can tackle greater successes in life. The moon's hora, even signs, and benefic planets will make for a more gentle, loving, easygoing, easy to get along with person. But those 2 things are separate from satisfaction. And when you mix it up, you get, say, an odd sign, a male planet, malefic planet in a female sign in the sun's hora won't be as powerful in acting out its needs as if it was in a male sign and the sun's hora. Okay? Pretty simple idea. Now here's a really interesting combination. A planet that is in its own hora makes one courageous. This is probably the most important yoga here in lots of ways. There's 2 reasons it's important. First of all, because it says a planet in its own hora. Well, that means we're talking about a hora chart with Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on. Otherwise, only the sun or moon could be in its own hora. But this says a planet, meaning any planet in its own hora makes you courageous. So that can only happen if we have a true hora chart. Okay? And this is from Saravelli. And Saravelli also talks about calculating a true hora chart. But somehow people overlook it and just use the hora of the sun and moon. So, when a planet's in its own hora, which only happens in a real hora chart, not just when you use the hora of the sun or moon, or like some astrologers do, put all the planets in Leo or Cancer, which is the wrong thing to do. But to have a real hora chart like we're using, then the person becomes courageous. Why courageous? Because you'll remember one of the important planets in the Hora chart is the third house, remember? Why? Because the number 2 has number 1 in it and number 2 in it. 1 plus 2 equals 3. So the third bhava is one of the important bhavas in the Hora chart. So it has a third house connotation. And earlier in the Hora class I mentioned how the third bhava in the Hora has to do with the energy with which we have to fulfill our responsibilities. Okay? That's a type of courage. To do what you have to do to take care of your responsibilities. The third house gives you that in the Hora. And any strong planet in the Hora can contribute to your responsible nature and your ability to get wealth. And any strong planet in the Hora will also contribute to your courage and energy you put into fulfilling your responsibilities. Okay? Because any strong planet in its own sign in any Varga chart is always going to help that Varga, right? So the things that Varga represents will get improved because of that strong planet. Real simple. So on planets in its own Hora, you get courage. Now this is not the kind of courage of going rock climbing and going skydiving and fighting in war necessarily. Though it can be that. It's the courage to do what you have to do to fulfill your responsibilities. To manage your material, concrete responsibilities. Okay? Sometimes that may mean going to war. Okay? So that kind of person with a good third chart house in the Hora will go to war when it's required to take care of their responsibilities with courage and so on. Okay. And then this next sutra is really fun too. Okay. If the third house is connected to a female Hora or occupied by a female planet, the person born will have a sister next after himself. Okay? If the condition is that the Hora of the third house or the planet occupying it is male, the person concerned will have a brother born immediately after him. So this is a way to tell if we have males or female siblings after us. Is this person born after us a male or female? Well, an odd planet and the sun's Hora on the cusp of the third bhava makes them a brother supposedly, and an even planet and or the Hora of the moon on the third cusp makes them female. Okay? Now, that's not going to really be accurate for saying the gender. But this is the same thing that we sort of talked about with the Lagna. When we talked about earlier, the Lagna in the Hora of the moon makes a person more feminine in nature, and the Lagna in the Hora of the sun makes a person more masculine in nature. So taking that same concept to the Lagna, if you have the Lagna in the Hora of the moon and a female planet in the Lagna, it doesn't mean automatically that you're going to be a female person, right? Okay, you may well be male. But it does mean that whether you're male or female, you're going to have a strong feminine nature. So you could be a male person with a strong feminine nature, for instance. So this sutra has to be used in that same way. When you look at the cusp of your third bhava and you want to see if the person's got a male or female sibling, well, you're just going to be able to tell if they're more masculine or more feminine in nature. You won't be able to tell just from this consistently if they're actually male or female bodied. But consistently you'll be able to see your brother or sister, whatever they are, is pretty aggressive and masculine initiative if the sun's Hora is on the third cusp and or there's a male planet there. And they'll say, yeah, I have a sister, but she's just a go-getter out there. She never sits still. She's always chasing men, not letting them chase her, and so on. Okay? She wears the pants in the family. Or, in the other side, if the third is in the moon's Hora and or there's a benefic or a female planet there, the person say, yeah, my brother is just really so sweet and easygoing, gets along with everybody, he's not pushy, but he's taking his time to find his place in the world, maybe. Or he's never really happy with the job he's doing, whatever. Or a person say, yeah, my sister, she's not like me at all. She's so mellow and laid back, and she's just so receptive because she has the moon's Hora with the female planet in the third. So this has to do with the nature of the person, whether they go about in life on a more masculine or more feminine nature in general. And you can apply this to any bhava in the chart. You can use to see your mother. Is my mother more in an aggressive masculine or feminine receptive person? Look at the cusp of the fourth house and find its Hora. and the planets, male or female, in the 4th house. Do the same for the 10th house for your father, and so on. And so through this, you can get an idea of the different people in your life and what their nature is going to be, more solar, more male, or more lunar and more female. And for that, this idea works very, very well. Okay? For any Baba, any house you want to see, look at your 2nd house. That'll give you the idea of your friends. Are your friends in general more masculine or feminine attuned? Okay? And it may mean you have more female friends or more male friends. You know, it could actually do with the actual gender. But more often than not, this technique is a lot more accurate when you apply it to the nature of the person and not their actual gender. Okay? So that's all the yogas there is, pretty much, on the Hora. So it's not a lot there, but there's some interesting things. We'll be examining those yogas in charts when we begin to look at Hora charts in the next video.